Well, I would like to thank all of you for coming, and I have to say that the quality of the presentations today has been excellent, yesterday as well, of course. In fact, the bar has been raised so high, I'm not so sure that I, being a short man, can reach it. However, I think the way to proceed is to begin with a few words from Stephen Fuller. I think that's how I'm going to begin.
I see. Now I'm going to take the rep.
No. Now, Stephen said, and I'm paraphrasing, that Catholics are not anti-science, but they do want to put science in its place. Well, in this paper, I try to develop a framework where philosophers, theologians, and scientists each have their place so they're not overstepping their bounds and doing things they shouldn't, in the hope of bringing some kind of reconciliation to all this fighting that's going on. People like Richard Dawkins are not very helpful in this regard, for example. All right, so I had to chop out half of my paper, so if it's less clear than it is, that's part of the reason. The rest is my fault. Best-selling books like Sam Harris's The End of Faith and Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, both of which argue that religious believers suffer from some kind of delusion, clearly indicate a rise in hostility between science and religion. In fact, some scientists are now calling on other scientists to take an active role in combating religion. For example, the famous physicist Steven Weinberg has recently said, quote, "Anything that we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in the end be our greatest contribution to civilization," end quote. While it may appear at times that science is at war with religion, philosopher of science Mariano Artigas and physicist Carl Giberson caution us against this interpretation. In their book, Oracles of Science, they argue that we get a distorted view of science if we only read scientists such as Dawkins and Weinberg. In contrast to these authors, they assure us that most scientists are not hostile to religion. The problem, as they see it, is that celebrity scientists are not always careful to distinguish their personal philosophical opinions from scientific positions in the popular writings that they have. While Artigas and Giberson are quite correct to point out the failure of some scientists to distinguish philosophical claims from science, I think this is just a symptom of a much deeper problem. The deeper problem is rooted in questions about the nature of science itself and its relation to other disciplines such as philosophy and theology. Indeed, I will argue that the scientific community has not given enough attention to these questions, and this has led to increased tensions between science and religion. In addition, I maintain that lack of attention to these questions has also jeopardized scientific progress and has hindered interdisciplinary work between scientists and members of other disciplines. To remedy the situation, I will propose and defend a neutral metaphysical framework for scientists and members of other disciplines to conduct their investigations. This framework is metaphysically neutral in the sense that it is compatible with both materialism and non-materialism, and thus it should be acceptable to both atheists and theists. The primary goal of this framework is to strengthen science and to facilitate interdisciplinary work between scientists and members of other disciplines, such as philosophy and theology. This framework will also help to clarify the autonomy and limits of the various disciplines, which I think should help to reduce some of the tensions, because a lot of these tensions arise when disciplines overstep their bounds. The needs for such a framework will become clearer as we examine the deficiencies of the current framework of science. Therefore, let's turn to that task now. Many scientists and philosophers of science have defended the view that scientists work within a naturalistic framework. This is not something limited only to celebrity scientists such as Dawkins and Weinberg. Indeed, the distinguished United States National Academy of Sciences has stated that, quote, "Science is a way of knowing about the natural world. It is limited to explaining the natural world through natural causes," end quote. This position is usually referred to as methodological naturalism, and it is very different from metaphysical naturalism. Methodological naturalism is an epistemological principle that governs how science is practiced. It prohibits the use of supernatural explanations in science. However, unlike metaphysical naturalism, methodological naturalism does not make any claims about the existence or non-existence of supernatural entities. Although methodological naturalism is not the same as metaphysical naturalism, I have argued elsewhere that its use in science, either as a necessary or provisional principle, is unjustified when science is understood as a kind of realism. Realism, roughly speaking, is the view that science aims at discovering objective truths about reality, where reality is understood as that which exists independently of our minds. Realism, in one form or another, has been the dominant view of science for most of history, and it is currently the dominant view among philosophers of science. Realists want to study the actual world, whatever it contains. But methodological naturalism limits science to natural explanations. Thus, although methodological naturalism is different from metaphysical naturalism, it still adds a type of metaphysical bias to science because it limits the metaphysical categories that one can use in scientific explanations. Such a bias is incompatible with a realist conception of science for several reasons, which we will explore next. I get involved in this in a much deeper way in the full version of my paper, but I'll discuss a little bit of it now. In studying the world, scientists should be free to follow the evidence wherever it leads, which includes positing new metaphysical categories if warranted. However, methodological naturalism is often understood to preclude this. For example, Eugenie Scott, an anthropologist who works for the National Center for Science Education, holds that methodological naturalism, quote, requires that scientific explanations use only material, matter, energy, and their interaction causes, end quote. When the metaphysical categories available for scientific explanation are restricted in this way, it is not difficult to see how this can lead to lack of progress and unwarranted reductions. For example, the physicist Sir John Maddox, during a discussion about what remains to be discovered by scientists, has said, quote, an explanation of the mind, like that of the brain, must ultimately be an explanation in terms of the way that neurons function. After all, there is nothing else on which to rest an explanation, end quote. While I do not want to rule out a priori that the mind can be fully explained through neurons, for Scott, scientists cannot come to any other conclusion, because she holds that methodological naturalism is a principle of science that is both necessary and a priori. But what if the human mind is not material? Then scientists will not be able to get at the truth unless they abandon methodological naturalism. As I have argued elsewhere, holding that methodological naturalism is merely a provisional assumption of science is also unjustified within a realist conception of science. Even some atheist philosophers, such as Evan Fales, admit that we should not assume that the supernatural, quote, is in principle beyond scientific investigation, end quote. Since we do not know what we will discover about the world prior to investigation, the correct scientific stance on the supernatural should be neutrality. That is, we neither affirm nor deny the existence of the supernatural. For this reason, there should be no necessary or provisional restrictions on the ontological status of scientific explanations. The only restriction that makes sense from a realist point of view is that scientific explanations must be testable. Therefore, rather than impose on science some preconceived understanding of natural or supernatural, I have argued that scientists should consider a different guiding principle, which I call methodological neutralism. The principle of methodological neutralism states that scientists should simply search for causes without setting any a priori conditions on what ontological status those causes must have. Once evidence is gathered, scientists can lean in favor of a cause being natural or supernatural as the evidence indicates. However, this is only tentative, as new discoveries might cause scientists to change their view about a particular cause's ontological status. There are many advantages to methodological neutralism. First, there is less chance of unwarranted reductions and lack of scientific progress because methodological neutralism does not put an a priori restriction on what ontological status scientific explanations must have. And because it is the evidence gathered that leads scientists to their conclusions, and if necessary, the positing of new metaphysical categories, methodological neutralism is preferable to methodological naturalism when science is understood as a kind of realism. Second, methodological neutralism is compatible with both materialism and non-materialism, and thus should be acceptable to both atheists and theists. For example, it might be the case that scientists never discover anything that would lead them to posit non-material categories. Then again, they might discover something that cannot be adequately explained by purely material categories. Unlike methodological naturalism, methodological neutralism allows for either possibility without tipping the scales one way or the other. Methodological neutralism is only one component of the neutral metaphysical framework that I am proposing. Another component is needed because methodological neutralism by itself cannot clarify the connections between science and other disciplines. These connections must be clarified because we need to know the boundary lines between science and other disciplines. And we need to know these boundary lines for at least 3 reasons. Number 1, to help prevent disciplines from overstepping their bounds. Number 2, to help preserve the autonomy of each discipline. And number 3, to facilitate interdisciplinary work, which is necessary for achieving the larger human goal of knowing as much as possible about the world. In order to build this framework, then, we will need to find something that all disciplines share. And whatever this is, it cannot be something that is shared accidentally or contingently, because that would be useless for drawing the boundary lines. Instead, it must be something that is essential to all of these disciplines, something they cannot do without, and something that necessarily relates them to each other. I contend that categories fulfill this role, because all branches of knowledge use categories. Categories are indispensable to abstract thought. In addition, every category necessarily has some kind of relation to every other category. However, as I will clarify later on, categories by themselves are not enough to draw the boundary lines between disciplines. This is because different disciplines can study the same category from different perspectives or with different methods. However, when categories are taken together with perspective, method, and aim, then the boundary lines between all branches of knowledge can be drawn. Before I illustrate how this is done, I need to clarify what I mean by category, lest I be accused of trying to smuggle in some kind of nominalism or conceptualism. I know what was going on in some of your minds when I said category. All right, you're worried. The understanding of category that I will employ is the one defended by the philosopher Jorge Gracia in his book Metaphysics and Its Task. There, Gracia argues that metaphysics is the study of categories, and it has several tasks. With respect to the most general categories, metaphysics aims to identify them, to define them if possible — it won't always be possible to define them — and to determine the relationships among these categories. With respect to the less general categories, metaphysics aims to fit them correctly into the most general categories, and to determine how they are related to all of the most general categories, including categories into which they do not fit. According to Gracia, a category is, quote, now this gets a little tricky, whatever is expressed by a term or expression, simple or complex, which can be predicated of some other term or expression, end quote. To understand what he means by category, it is important to note 2 things. First, categories are not predicates. For Gracia, predicability is the exclusive property of words. To predicate is to join words to other words in a certain way for Gracia. In contrast, categories are what the predicable words express. Now, when he says express, he's using it in a technical sense. Some words express extramental entities, other words express concepts, and still other words express words. For example, if I say the Triceratops is a dinosaur that existed during the late Cretaceous period, the predicable word Triceratops expresses something extramental. If, however, and of course I can give examples, like a dream. If I talk about a dream expresses something that only exists in a mind. If, however, we cannot express something by a predicable word, then it is not a category. Individual entities such as Socrates or Plato's knowledge of grammar are not categories because they cannot be predicated. Although Gracia's usage of category and express is not standard, it has several advantages. One advantage is that it allows him to talk about categories in a neutral way that avoids reducing all categories to words or concepts or extramental entities. This allows him to define metaphysics as the study of categories without reducing metaphysics to realism, conceptualism, or nominalism. Still, Gracia's view of metaphysics is a kind of realism because he holds that at least some categories are more than words or concepts. In addition, his view of metaphysics does not necessarily exclude insights from other conceptions of metaphysics. For example, by adopting Gracia's view of metaphysics, we do not have to reject Aquinas' understanding of existence, esse, or actus essendi for you Latin people who like the Latin, or analogous predication. We don't have to reject those necessarily. Okay? Another advantage of Gracia's understanding of category is that category is neutral with respect to all other categories, not just with respect to the categories word, concept, and extramental entity. This helps in 2 ways. First, it prevents unwarranted reductions because, quote, each category is what it is as expressed by its definition, and therefore cannot be reduced to any other category unless the conditions that it satisfies makes such reduction legitimate, end quote. Second, this leaves it to members of other disciplines to identify, define, and determine the relationships among the less general categories based on the results of their investigations. This is in harmony, of course, with a realistic conception of science. Metaphysicians, in contrast, will not intrude on other disciplines because they're not concerned with the less general categories, except, as I explained above, to the extent that they are related to the most general categories. Finally, another advantage of Gracia's neutral understanding of category is that it allows metaphysics to cover a wide range of objects, and therefore to provide the categorical foundation of all branches of knowledge, including the sciences. Indeed, Gracia argues that, quote, metaphysics is logically presupposed by every other view that one may have. We can, of course, practice other disciplines and hold other views without consciously practicing metaphysics or holding metaphysical views. But in these cases, we do in fact vicariously engage in metaphysics and hold metaphysical views. For the views we hold logically presuppose views about the most general categories, their interrelations, and the relation of the less general categories we use to the most general categories. Metaphysics is inescapable, end quote. I think that the neutral categorical scheme and understanding of metaphysics discussed by Gracia above is helpful to clarifying the autonomy and limits of science and for facilitating interdisciplinary work between science and other disciplines. To illustrate this, let us consider a very controversial topic in the science and religion debate, namely whether evolutionary biology and teleology are compatible. Was the evolution of conscious, intelligent life a mere accident or not? Even scientists are divided on this point. For example, Stephen Jay Gould held that the emergence of human life was an accident. In contrast, Simon Conway Morris has argued that the emergence of something close to human-like intelligence is not an accident, but a near inevitability. And of course, members of the religious community have entered into this discussion as well. Consider, for example, the words of Pope Benedict XVI, delivered in his very first homily as pontiff. Quote, "We are not some casual and meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed. Each of us is loved. Each of us is necessary," end quote. If the neutral metaphysical framework I am proposing is to be of any use, it must be able to guide the above discussion fruitfully and to help facilitate interdisciplinary work while making sure that the disciplines involved do not overstep their bounds. So let us examine it in action. The first step in this situation is to determine which categories are involved in the controversy. In this case, the most important categories are evolution, contingency, purpose, causality, and divinity, or God. The second step will be to determine where precisely the controversy lies. The controversy in this case is whether evolution should be thought of as having a purpose, that is, a goal, or not. The third step is to identify why the categories in question are perceived to be in conflict. Why is evolution thought to be incompatible with a purpose or goal? Here the reason is that some scientists see evolution as being completely driven by contingent causes. They might say, for example, that genetic mutations are random, and natural selection only selects currently existing organisms. It does not plan for the future. The fourth step is to analyze the alleged conflict between these categories and to determine which disciplines or discipline is capable of handling and resolving this issue. Are contingency and purpose incompatible categories of causality? And which discipline is capable of handling this question? One thing that is clear is that the methods of the empirical sciences are not equipped to resolve the above question. The reason is that the a posteriori experimental methods of science cannot be used to determine if general categories like contingency and purpose are incompatible categories of causality. Instead, it is metaphysics that studies the relationship of the most general categories to each other, and in this case, the a priori method of conceptual analysis, which is part of the metaphysician's toolkit, is necessary to the task at hand. Once scientists realize this, they must hand over this problem to a discipline that can resolve it, which in this case is metaphysics. As a metaphysician, I would argue that contingency and purpose are only mutually exclusive when they exist at the same level of causality. However, both can operate on different levels an intelligent agent can use contingency, for example, to attain a goal. Just to give a little trivial example, I can make students pull names out of a hat, which is certainly a contingent process, to ensure the goal that the order in which they present their oral presentations is unbiased by me. All right. The above example, which involves the categories evolution, contingency, purpose, causality, shows how biologists can encounter a question that they cannot answer. Although I argue that metaphysicians can answer the question of whether or not contingency and purpose are compatible categories of causality, other disciplines also deal with these categories. For example, theologians deal with the categories of contingency and purpose in relation to divine causality. As such, they too can comment on the topic of evolution and purpose from that perspective. In 2004, the International Theological Commission issued a document titled Communion and Stewardship, Human Persons Created in the Image of God, which did address the relation between the mechanisms of evolution and divine causality. Quote, according to the Catholic understanding of divine causality, true contingency in the created order is not incompatible with a purposeful divine providence. Divine causality and created causality radically differ in kind and not only in degree. Thus, even the outcome of a truly contingent natural process can nonetheless fall within God's providential plan for creation, end quote. The above discussion illustrates some clear advantages of the neutral metaphysical framework that I am proposing. First, when an issue cannot be decided by science, scientists must remain neutral on that issue and turn it over to another discipline or disciplines that can handle it. This helps to prevent unwarranted reductions. Second, it also helps preserve the autonomy of science because other disciplines must turn over questions that they can't handle or that could be appropriately studied by science to science. Third, for these reasons, this framework helps to reduce tensions between different disciplines, such as science and religion, because philosophers can mediate problems between these groups and tell one or the other when they're overstepping their bounds and why. Fourth, the neutral categorical scheme above is broad enough to be able to interface with the categories of all other disciplines, and therefore it facilitates interdisciplinary work. Fifth and finally, this interdisciplinary work promotes the overarching goal of human knowledge, that is to acquire as much knowledge as we can. I just have one other paragraph if I can. As human knowledge increases, interdisciplinary work becomes more and more necessary. This is because the more disciplines grow in knowledge, the closer they come to touch other disciplines. The analogy I like to use to understand this is that of a tapestry. Human knowledge is divided into different disciplines just as square pieces of cloth are woven into a huge tapestry. Over time, some pieces become sewed together, such as biology and chemistry. But then, as we have seen above, biologists can encounter questions about purpose and other categories that require input from other disciplines, such as metaphysics and theology. In order to complete the tapestry of human knowledge, all disciplines must work together as best as they can. And to do this, they need a common conceptual framework, one that is neutral and able to interface with all categories imaginable. And as I've argued above, I think that my principle of methodological neutralism and Gracia's categorical scheme together work very nicely in this regard. Thank you very much.
We'll let Russell have a go, and then it's Alessandra. No, take your microphone, Russell.
What's the order in which a problem is allotted to a particular discipline? Is it science first and then the others? If it's science first and then the others, on what basis is that priority conferred?
Well, it's not like there's some World Health Organization or World Body or UN for scientists and philosophers that says, okay, we're gonna give this to the philosophers, something like that. I think on some level, when you combine the categories that are studied with the perspective from which they're studied, with the method and the aim, you sort of get a sense of the topology of how the disciplines are separated to some extent. Now, there will be times when biologists might encounter a question that they can't fully answer, and so they'll want to work with philosophers, okay? But I'm not going to enforce this in some kind of, totalitarian way or something like that.
Because I was going to say, isn't the very categorization a breach of metaphysical neutrality?
You should have been careful. Russell always has a supplementary.
I'm sorry, you said that...
Surely the very process of categorization is a breach of metaphysical neutrality.
I try, I don't know if I'm successful, but I try to have a neutral categorical scheme. Now, in what way do you think my scheme breaches the
Well,
neutrality?
firstly, presumably it's not neutral as between the need for categorization and the need for categorization.
Not absolutely,
and that in and of
simpliciter, yeah.
itself, would, if it's worked through, would clearly have profound metaphysical implications.
You really think that would be a severe stumbling block or problem? The fact that it's not neutral?
I don't think it's a stumbling block, but I do think that it's not neutral.
It's somewhat neutral, though. I mean,
it's only
you're bringing
neutral
up, it seems to me, a triviality of that in the sense that, I mean, all disciplines of abstract thought require categories. You wouldn't dispute that, right?
Well, no, because of my particular metaphysical...
So in that sense, the fact that I want to have a categorical scheme, I mean, it's fairly benign, it seems to me. No?
Well, I don't know. Just the sort of their echoes of Kant and
No. But remember, I'm not
I know.
understanding categories in a Kantian way. Okay, Gracia has a very technical sense of categories. It's it's a neutral way.
Alexander Stasinski, if you pass the microphone.
Yes.
Hello, thanks for your talk. It seems to me that the categories you're talking about are very similar to the sets that mathematicians talk about. Collections of objects defined by predication over certain variables. And that the study of, the metaphysics, as you described, as the study of categories, is just a sort of concrete reformulation of what mathematics is all about.
Well, all right, keep going. If you
and also, I think you mentioned that you're a realist when it comes to these categories. Not just a nominalist.
At least some of the categories are more than words or concepts. So in that sense, he's a realist.
Okay. So then you would have the same benefits and the same problems as a realist of mathematics would have, because it's a very sort of analogous situation.
Is this the whole argument whether mathematics is a discovery about the world or whether it's invented, some kind of Humean thing?
Well, yeah. So that's one question, but it seems to me so. Would you agree that these ideas about studies of categories are very similar to certain parts of mathematics, and
well, the short answer
both of these things are very close to metaphysics?
Wait, what was the second part?
That both of these two things, your categories and mathematics.
The short answer is no, in the sense that I don't want to reduce all categories to sets. I think maybe that's sort of where you're leading. If we did reduce them all to sets, some of these problems would arise. But sets are only one type of category. Okay. Many of the categories are more like universals, but not all of them are universals either. It's a very...
Can you give an example of a category which is not a set?
Divinity. Oh, I'm sorry. A category that's not a set.
There are sets with one element. It's not a...
I have. Well, you're going to talk about the null set or something like that. If I said nothing, you'd probably say, right, it's like a null set or something like that. Right? Nothing is a category. Square circle is a category. It's a very, very broad notion of category.
Okay. So you also include sets that mathematically would not exist, but sort of conceptually
No, I'm just saying that sets
exist.
are only one type of category. I don't want to reduce categories all to sets. I don't want to make that move.
Steve Fuller, then Carl Geiderson, and then it's Mariano. Very good.
I'm a little concerned about the rather bureaucratic role you have for the philosopher here.
I was anticipating this.
And in particular, it seems to me that part of the way you're presenting this, and in a way I realize it's to enhance the plausibility of what you're saying, is to make disciplines seem very static. And that there's a sense in which In fact, it sometimes it sounds almost a bit like logical positivism sometimes, right? In the sense that, once we clarify what we're talking about, we can assign the project to the right discipline, right? And disciplines don't really relate to each other like that historically, right? In fact, disciplines kind of come and go and merge, and there are a lot of border conflicts, right, which often end up not with the idea or the project going to one discipline or another, but one discipline absorbing part of another discipline. Right, that is often an outcome of these things. I mean, philosophy, actually, history of philosophy is, largely a history of losing ground. Right, that ends up forcing you into this position of having to make a justification for philosophy's existence. Right, because that's kind of what you're doing there. Right, that 100 or 200 years ago you wouldn't have had to do. But it relies on this very static notion of discipline. That's really my main and that. One of the consequences of these kind of border disputes that you're talking about is that disciplinary boundaries change. It's not just that there's interdisciplinary work, which I understand, there is that too, but there's also changes of disciplinary boundaries where, in a sense, at some point, either the theologian or Richard Dawkins wins on something, and the other one or his successors just shuts up or disappears. And you don't seem to allow for that as a possibility, but that does happen historically.
Well, let me try to answer your question this way, and if it's not satisfactory, I'm sure you'll tell me. Let's take the category being. Right now, there was a joke made, I believe you made it, about some Anglo-Saxons may not be sure what we mean by metaphysics or ontology. Right? In Gracia's scheme, ontology is a branch of metaphysics that studies being. Now, it studies being from a certain perspective and with a certain method and a certain aim. So, for example, the way that philosophers study being is going to be different from the way that theologians relying on revelation are going to study being, right? And different from the way, well, let's just put it away. There's a difference between those two disciplines. Now, you wouldn't want to say that somehow in the future those two could be collapsed, would you? The theological way of studying being and the philosophical or metaphysical way of studying being?
I think it could very well happen. I mean, I think the boundaries could be rearranged.
But insofar as philosophy doesn't use revelation, it's not allowed to. It's a purely rational enterprise that could never be collapsed. We don't allow revelation in. Unless, of course, you're going to start mangling the definition of what philosophy is.
I think you're being much too a prioristic about disciplines, unless you mean discipline in some idealized sense of the word. But if you mean disciplines as they're actually constituted as knowledge-producing entities, I think you're being much too a prioristic. Maybe discipline belongs as one of your categories, perhaps. No, really, because it seems to me it's at that level of second-orderedness.
Right. Well, let me see if I'm understanding. You're saying that it's possible that in the future, people, I don't know, the great-great-grandson of Richard Dawkins might be saying, well, it's fine for us to use passages from the Bible in biology and chemistry. Is that what you're saying? That you could foresee that happening? I don't foresee that ever happening. Perhaps you do, though.
I think it might go the other way around, actually.
They'd be using science in the theological study or something.
Yeah, I mean, and stuff.
But
stuff like that.
You did concede though that it probably won't happen the other way though.
That has happened. Yeah. Stuff like that has happened.
But because it has happened doesn't mean it should happen.
No, but then that's an issue about the status of the claim you're making. Okay, I mean, I guess that's what's the normative status of the claim that's being made here? No, because I do think you're kind of ignoring that how history has rearranged disciplinary boundaries and issues that used to be seen as one part of one discipline is now part of another discipline. Well, we're now entering into a period where there's a lot of open border conflicts.
In some of those cases, though, I think maybe that if a discipline got absorbed, I don't think it was legitimate in all those cases. That would be one of my criticisms. We need a way to define whether or not absorbing was legitimate.
Legitimacy is on this.
I think Carl has a question too. Okay. I did enjoy this.
Thank you very much for that talk. It was great. I spent the last several years of my life in science and religion, and I'm kind of used to science being talked about as you're talking about it. But when I was a younger, less evolved person, I was a physicist in a laboratory who shone lasers on helium atoms and put them in certain quantum states and then measured them and so on. And when I go back to that perspective, this kind of discussion seems incredibly disconnected from the way science actually is. I went all the way through to get a PhD at Rice University. I never once heard the word ontology, epistemology, metaphysics. Didn't even hear the phrase scientific method. And when I hear methodological naturalism described as if it is some sort of philosophical a priori assumption that sort of rigidly constrains the scientific enterprise, that seems very unfamiliar to this kind of younger version of myself. I mean, it seems to me that methodological naturalism is just a shorthand technique that has developed over the years that scientists use, not because it's been philosophically hammered out, but because when we didn't use that technique, we found ourselves pursuing blind alleys, and we look back and we see Newton with his comets coming in to correct the solar system's imbalances because God was tuning things up every once in a while. We saw 19th century naturalists kind of weighing bodies as they died to look at the weight of the soul as it departed and so on. And we look at that and we just say, those just prove to be kind of dead end and useless. And so methodological naturalism, it seems to me, is not a priori at all. It's just a technique that we use. It's provisional. And I compared it in my last book to the methodological naturalism of plumbing. I mean, plumbers are methodological naturalists. They pursue only natural causes for the problems that they're trying to solve. But yet we don't dignify their approach with a philosophical term, and we don't critique it as being narrow and call it a priori and so on. We don't even talk about it because we don't care. And so on. So I wonder whether we over-philosophize the scientific method.
Well, let me tell you how I would respond to that, if I may. In my framework, which doesn't seem to be very popular right now, in my framework, we would say, okay, we're having a discussion now about method. Should methodological naturalism be a principle of science or not? Now, what discipline is capable of handling that? It seems to me philosophers of science would have to handle that question. You see, so in that sense, you're right. It's not something that you scientists working in the lab are going to trouble yourselves about. But it is an important thing within the context of interdisciplinary work. And so I do think we have to try to find out where should this discussion take place. And so in that sense, my framework provides a way of determining where it would take place. And secondly, I would say, now wait a minute. Are you actually defending that we should keep methodological naturalism? Are you saying that we don't even need to talk about it? Or you're saying that my methodological neutralism isn't really helpful? I'm trying to figure out where you are in that spectrum.
Yeah, I'm saying this isn't very relevant or connected to the way science actually works. It only arises.
Well, hold on.
Kind of pull science into another kind of discussion.
Well, all right. Let me give you an example then. There's a book by Robert Geist. I don't remember the exact title. I think it's something like Reductionist Circularities in the Mind-Body Problem or something like this. But apparently, and of course I'm sure some of you are skeptical about this, but apparently there have been some people who have been on operating tables. They've had these big heart surgeries and bypasses and things. And of course, they have to put them out, and there's screens in front of them and stuff like that. And supposedly, some of them were claimed that they floated out of their body and they were able to watch the procedure and they could say what happened and this was corroborated and all this kind of stuff. Now, suppose in the future, maybe 500 years from now, this happens with greater frequency, right? And you can't find a natural explanation for this except that it seems like there's some ability to have disembodied knowledge or something like this. You wouldn't want the scientists to say, well, we can't really talk like that because we have to be naturalists and materialists or something like that, right? I think scientific explanations just have to be testable. Don't worry about putting these naturalistic or supernatural, prohibitions or whatever. Just as long as they're testable, that's okay.
The way people talk about methodological naturalism, it's almost as if scientists would be incapable of ever discovering.
Well, you heard Sir John Maddox. He said that an explanation of the mind must be in neurons because there's nothing else on which it could possibly be done.
But he can only say that because he's talking about an area of science where we just know diddly squat. I mean, we know nothing.
He sounds like he's precluding it for all time. He sounds like he's precluding it.
Go 500 years ahead in the future when we might be able to say something intelligible. No one's going to be talking like that.
I think we'll have to move on to Mariano.
Well, this is going to be very simple. I'm a scientist, so I'm going to give you a view from the trenches.
Okay.
Now, I hope you correct me if I'm oversimplifying your position, but
sure.
You seem to suggest that we should limit ourselves to work in the lab and test phenomena, and then hand over to you to give us.
Not exactly. If you were interested, for example, in doing more, you could go to some center where you could work with philosophers on a topic and then do whatever you want. I think or you could study philosophy too, and then you'd be both, and then you could. Do some more.
Well, assuming I don't want to study philosophy.
But that's the problem, you see.
No.
That's the problem. You want to do it all without the other disciplines, but knowledge doesn't work that way. To build this big tapestry,
Well,
we
but
need these
what
other
you're
disciplines.
saying is that the role of metaphysics is that of mediating.
Partly.
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 Okay.
Partly.
So my point is that from a scientist point of view, the risk is that you're going to have or play the role of, or you can end up in a sort of God of the gaps situation where you can't explain certain things in sort of material or naturalistic way. So you turn into a non-supernatural explanation. So how can you deal with that?
I don't think we really are in danger of a God of the gaps here. Yeah.
That's what
Well, could you give
Can
me an
that-
example why you think my view would lead to that? Could you give a...
For example, your example of the mind.
Right.
So neuroscientists can explain it very, very well without any recourse.
Okay, let's take the mind, okay? Take the hard problem of consciousness,
Yeah, exactly.
right? Right.
I'm not saying that I agree with that.
Okay,
Of course.
sure.
But I can say that from a scientific point of view, you can explain everything.
Okay. Suppose a scientist wanted to argue... What? Oh, hold on. Suppose a scientist wanted to argue that the hard problem of consciousness is not really a problem. We can explain it all with neurons, right? Now, he or she would have to find some way of developing some kind of tests that would, and also that view would have to be somehow falsifiable. Now, suppose they couldn't come up with a way that tests could make this view falsifiable or whatever, or the opposite falsifiable. Then they would have to say, well, look, this is something that our methods can't handle. So we're neutral on this, and we pass it off to other people who can handle it. So you see, my framework doesn't want gaps. It's about, can we handle this? Can we devise an experiment? If we can't, well, then we'll remain neutral and let others deal with this problem, like philosophers.